I will go ahead and give a little advanced, introduction. Dr. Mitchell is actually a nationally known and more internationally known expert when it comes to critical incident stress management. So Dr. Mitchell's presentation touches on stress inside the EOC, outside the EOC, why it matters. And don't think for 1 minute. What I like to introduce this presentation with is this: no one is immune from emotion, not one person. And if you are, good on you. But the chances are you will eventually be permeated, penetrated, and you will break. And after a period of time, those 30 disasters, I broke. And it's okay. I'm back. I'm stronger. I reflect now. So with that, Dr. Mitchell, I assume you're ready?
I am.
All right. Thank you, guys.
Well, thank you, and welcome to everybody. Hope you're having a good morning. It's bright and sunny here in Maryland, sort of like a California day. And we're going to be talking about emergency operations and emergency operations center stress. Just so you know, I have a background in the field of psychology. I teach at the University of Maryland in the Emergency Health Services Department. I'm the co-founder of the International Critical Incident Stress Foundation. And I spend a lot of my time running around the world doing programs like this. So happy to be with you today. And so we're going to look at the emergency operations and EOC stress. So first of all, the objectives that I would have is to help you to understand that EOC, as well as field operations, very stressful environments, and we're going to look at the types of stress that people can run into in these environments. I want to identify some of the stress symptoms we have, and we're going to look at the harmful effects of stress and how it may show up within emergency operations, and then I'm going to give you some guidelines that might be helpful to you in managing the EOC type of stress. Okay. First and foremost, we do have bioecological stress. This is the kind of stress that goes on when you have a very warm environment or a very cold environment. And we hear people complain all the time about their workplaces that it's cold or it's hot. You also have things that are going on in the environment around you: noise, dirt, dust, confusion, crowding, all those kinds of things are considered bioecological stress. Another form of stress that you're likely to run into is personality-based stress. That's stuff that you don't have to work hard to get because it comes with you. You arrive wherever you're working with your own personality, and some people seem to be very stable day to day. Other people have their ups and their downs. They have very bad hair days. So personality stress is the kind of stress that you come to your job with. There's interpersonal stress, which is the relationships that you have with other people at the workplace. And then there's a whole category of stresses that are called high intensity, high performance, high risk, and high responsibility. Those kinds of stresses are the things that are produced by the nature of the job that you have. So a little bit more information on the bioecological: noise, clutter, confusion. I've been in EOCs during disaster operations. The noise level can be pretty extreme. Sometimes people keep bringing more and more pieces of paper and maps and whatever else into the environment as the situation unfolds. So you end up with some clutter. There's a lot of confusion as to what's going on. Communications are not always up to par. So bioecological stress is going to be alive and well in your environment. You also end up getting extra personnel in. Sometimes you're bringing in the next shift early, or people are staying over from one shift, so you're getting extra personnel. You have a limited space to work in ordinarily, and now it's just going to get a whole lot worse. There are longer hours to work with. There's a lot of different monitoring devices that you're working off of. And major disasters will produce changes in your normal eating habits. Sometimes the water in the environment where you are. You run out of the bottled water you took from home, and now you're using the water from the facility, and that's not always agreeable to everybody. Certainly what you can count on in disaster is sleep cycle disruptions. People don't get as much rest. They're on call constantly. They may be hyper aroused and having a hard time getting any sleep at night, even though they may be very tired. It's just a different environment than usual, hard to get back to sleep, hard to get to sleep in the first place. As I mentioned before, heat and cold. Things that you can pretty well count on is equipment failures or total breakdowns, and that can make for a very bad day from inside the EOC. Personality-based stress, you come with personal anxieties, worries. While you're busy having your disaster, real life continues. You may have family issues, family problems going on. You could have a sick child at home. So all these things are going to add into some of the personality issues, your own anxieties and worries. You may have from past experiences pretty traumatic memories that are now coming up while you're trying to work this new situation. You have external relationship issues that maybe the person you love is having a very tough time, and they may continue to intrude with the issues that are going on with them while you're trying to deal with a major situation. Another thing that's very stressful is limited contact with family and friends. And I can tell you of a fire station down in the Orlando area, and the policy is when there's a hurricane coming, they move families of the on-duty crew into that fire station. The building is stronger and well protected. The personnel don't have to worry about my family's at home going through a hurricane, so they tend to move them in where the operations crew are actually working. And that they can do because they've had so many years of practice with hurricanes. They know what to be expecting, and they know pretty much how long you're going to have to stay within the station. And they put bunks out for people. It's it's mostly military sleeping, but at least they're nearby their family. Now you have the interpersonal stress. We all have different work styles. We kind of get into our habits. We like it the way we like it. When you are suddenly dealing with extra personnel in the environment, you may find some conflict with them. You may find that the way they work is not the way you like to work. For instance, they may be standing and moving around and shifting from foot to foot while you're sitting down trying to handle calls and manage other aspects of the disaster. So there could be some friction over work styles. You have to share close spaces with others. And you may be working with somebody you just simply don't like. I know we all like to think that, oh, I can get along with everybody. Well, when you crank up the pressure of a disaster situation, there may be some people who have personality characteristics that you simply do not like, and you don't, or you may not even trust them. We also have, I'm sure it's not out there where you work in California, but I know that many people where I work will tell you that some supervisors can be very demanding. They bring intensified scrutiny to an already difficult situation, and you can pretty well count on your privacy is rapidly shrinking as you go through the work of disaster. Now, this is what I call the H slide. It's a whole series of very challenging things. One is the work you do is high intensity. It's got high performance, and the demands of your performance are going to be very high just because the situation is a disaster. You're going to have high risk in some of the decisions you're making. If you tell somebody to stay on the line, the threat may be coming in their door. So there is a high risk. Mistakes can have a costly effect. There's a very high degree of personal responsibility that goes on with this kind of work. multiple simultaneous operations, very fast pace. You're going to have short decision times, multiple high priority issues. People have to be awakened with it. You have to make on the ball actions with little supervisory input. Nobody's there to turn around to and say, what should I do in this situation? Because they're busy with 10 other things at the same time. So you're going to be making decisions that are going to be pretty intense. There could be, in some circumstances, life and death circumstances. Failure to act now may mean that somebody dies in 10 minutes. High degree of personal responsibility. When people have that level of activity and stress and something goes wrong, they tend to personalize it and start blaming themselves for what has happened there. And add to that other types of stress. Everyday stress does not fade away, does not disappear. It's there all the time. We have general stress. People have it every day. It is not traumatic. It's not terribly difficult to deal with if you have time. General stress is going to be there. It could mount up. You don't have the time to deal with the everyday stresses of life. You're being clobbered with everything else coming at you at the same time. Now, general stress, when not managed, turns into cumulative stress. And cumulative stress has this tendency to build and build and build, and then eventually it becomes pretty explosive for people who have allowed this to build up. Again, you have very little time to deal with those everyday issues while you're dealing with major events that are happening in your community. Another thing that you run into, particularly field operations, you can go up against something that causes critical incident stress. Death of a baby is one that I think of frequently as a very high level of stress that comes from that. It's critical incident stress. You can have death to innocent people. You can have accidents among your own fellow workers. All these kinds of things can create an atmosphere called critical incident stress. And then we have conditions that result from exposure to traumatic stress. Those conditions are many and varied. A lot of people think post-traumatic stress disorder is like automatic. Have a bad thing happen and you get post-traumatic stress disorder. And let me put this out very clearly here. There is no automatic pathway from a traumatic event to post-traumatic stress disorder. If you take the population of the United States, in the course of a lifetime, 9.75% of people develop post-traumatic stress disorder in the course of their lifetime. So that means a little bit more than 90% of people who go through traumatic events are not getting post-traumatic stress disorder. But there's a number of other things that they can get. We have general stress, which I mentioned. I'll come back to the post-traumatic stress shortly. General stress, everybody has it. There are no exceptions. Here's the deal. If you have a pulse, you have stress. When we take all your stress away, you die. So consider the options. Have stress or die, right? It's a normal condition of life. Everybody has stress, right? No exceptions. There are two major types of stress. Eustress is called a positive stress, okay? It's exciting, it's interesting, can be fun. And then there's distress, which is the uncomfortable version of stress. I like to put it a different way. Eustress is what your kids are feeling when they're going to Disney World. Distress is what you're feeling when you're paying for Disney World. It's the same stimulus, the reaction is different, okay? Now, in general stress, what we can pretty well count on is recovery is typical. It is not atypical, it's typical. It's what usually happens. Cumulative stress is a piling up of stress over time. and it comes directly from not dealing with general stress when general stress is going on. So cumulative stress builds and builds and builds. It eventually becomes known as burnout. However, burnout is a overused, misunderstood, misapplied, and too frequently applied term. So I don't use burnout anymore. I talk about it as cumulative stress, which is mounting up of stress over time. What you can count on with cumulative stress is that it's destructive to people's health, to their job performance, and to their performance at home. Their relationships deteriorate, and their personality will begin to change, not in a very nice way either. So it goes negative. Now, there's trauma-induced stress, and the most well-known is critical incident stress, and it's the normal, okay? It's the normal, healthy reaction of normal, healthy people to a terribly abnormal event. Now, I can use that word normal as many times in a sentence as you dare. However, normal does not mean absence of pain. In fact, it is very painful to go through a critical incident stress. Here's the good news about critical incident stress. No matter how disturbing, awful, terrible the event is, the vast majority of people will recover from critical incident stress. Okay? So certainly is hopeful that people will get through this condition. Again, it's a normal response of normal, healthy people to a terribly abnormal event. If critical incident stress does not get managed, preferably sooner than later, you might end up with brief psychotic reaction. A brief psychotic reaction is also good news there. It's brief, okay? Brief psychotic reaction is that a person could actually have major signs and symptoms of psychosis. They can have, for instance, excuse me, they could have hallucinations, illusions, delusions, serious thought disorder. But with brief psychotic reaction, they may have those psychotic symptoms for a short period of time. And then what usually happens is once you remove the stimulus, the brief psychotic reaction disappears. Okay. So in some cases, it might mean the beginning of more serious problems to come. In other cases, a brief psychotic reaction may be a once in a lifetime thing, never happen again. And then we can see other conditions coming up, such as substance abuse. Most common, of course, is alcohol. And people kind of think, wow, if I just drink enough of this stuff, it'll make it go away. It'll only make it worse is what it does. So if you think that surround and drown is a good stress management technique, you might need to get some therapy for that because it's not going to work. You may encounter personality changes. One of the common ones is depression. People can also develop panic attacks as a result of exposure to a traumatic event. And as I said before, PTSD can come around, but it is not the only thing that comes about. Many of these other things, and that's a short list, so you can have other things that come up as well. The signs and symptoms, people become very alert, very aware, they're keyed up, they're ready to respond to something that you would expect and that you would want, because you don't want somebody who's a little bit too laid back when your house is burning to the ground. All right, so you need that high alert. Rapid breathing, sometimes yawning. What does yawning have to do with stress? Yawning is a compensatory mechanism. You yawn when you don't have enough oxygen in your system, so the brain signals the reflexes, the breathing reflexes, to yawn to bring in a larger volume of air so you can get more oxygen into your system. Heart rate will increase, elevated stress chemicals. The chemical of stress is known as cortisol, okay? And cortisol is that chemical that naturally occurs in the body. It'll keep you up and at it and alert. There are some side effects to cortisol, and one of the first side effects is that at lower levels, lower dosages of cortisol, you will have increased memory. Okay. And that may also be emergency memory where something really bad has happened and your system's absorbing it, so you stay away from those things in the future. But cortisol can have another side effect, and that is with extreme levels of cortisol in the system, it will cause memory dysfunction. So it's helpful on one side and very damaging on the second side. Okay. Um, and cortisol is the natural occurring chemical in a stress response. So you can't do away with it, because then you would not have a stress response, and you need that. During stress reactions, the eye scan, there's a change in perceptual focus, so wide range of things there. So as you can see, there's other signs and symptoms of stress. Um, You'll get an increase in neurotransmitters, adrenaline, noradrenaline. In the old days, about 40 years ago, we used to think that adrenaline got the muscles all tensed up and ready for action. Well, that's a minor job. What the neurotransmitters do, adrenaline and noradrenaline, is they help the brain to exchange information at a very rapid pace, probably 6,000 times faster than what happens in a non-stress situation. So your brain can absorb and interpret information and then help to create the proper response to that, if that be running or fighting, whatever it is. Another thing that happens with stress response is that people do a mental review of the past. I have very many times been asked, does that really happen? Does your brain really review everything? Yes, it does. It does it in microseconds, and it will go through all the memories you have. It's kind of like going to your attic and you're trying to sort through all the junk that's in your attic and figure out, is there anything up here that's useful to us? Well, in the mental review of the past, your brain has its own attic. It's going through all the memories. It's trying to figure out, is there something we can do right now? Is there something useful in all these memories that'll help us deal with the situation? And it tries all the common sites of memory, and then it might eventually give up by saying to itself, there's no intelligent life here, let's just move on. And then you get novel solutions, which are not always going to be the ones that work. We have a preparation for fight or flight, and hopefully you don't get into the third F, which is the freeze. The freeze is the deer in the headlights response, where you just don't know what to do, where to go, or anything like that. So you get kind of stuck. You will also have selective activation or suppression of bodily functions. And we don't need to have sphincter muscle control during a stress response. Okay? So your body says, that's not so important. Let it rip. And of course, your response might be, well, that could be embarrassing not to have sphincter muscle control in the midst of this problem. And your brain will be saying, this is about survival. Don't worry about your sphincter muscle. Just move the action to the larger muscle groups. So there you have a little problem in which you're trying to deal with both issues. One is that you have to take care of your personal needs, and the other one is you have to take care of the situation. So how does the stress show up in the EOC? One of the things that you will get from people is complaints of fatigue. I feel so tired. I can barely keep my eyes open. If I put my head down on this desk, I'm just going to fall asleep right now. Now, another thing that can happen is people disengage from the action. They can take so much and they can't maintain it anymore, so they start disengaging. And disengagement may mean they can take on a who cares attitude, or they can become easily distracted from the work at hand, and that may cause some pretty significant problems. So disengagement is certainly a big, serious problem in an EOC. By the way, if supervisors make sure that all personnel take appropriate breaks periodically, even in the worst of the circumstances, people need to get breaks. If the supervisors make sure that everybody gets reasonable breaks after a reasonable amount of time on the operation, this can be prevented. Right? It's when you stretch them out all the way to the end where they don't have any energy left. That's where you may find some problems. You may get increasing anxiety, frustration, emotional outburst. People become very labile. Labile is a term that means easily brought to an emotional discharge. That may be tears, it may be anger, frustration, venting those feelings on other people. Another thing you may run into is some vague feelings of being very sad and depressed because the situation continues on, and bad things are happening to other people. So depression and sadness can come up. Very common reaction in disaster work within operations and even in the EOC. People get angry and irritable, and they start letting that stuff show to everybody else. Another thing that comes up is people forget important little features of their job. It's unusual forgetfulness. All of us forget to some degree or another. But when you have experienced people who are forgetting really important and fairly simple tasks, that can be a major problem in an emergency operations center. Other things that you may have is decision-making declines. And it's a bad time to have decision-making decline when you're in the midst of a disaster. You need the ability to make fast decisions. So you cannot afford to have decision-making just go down. Problem solving is very hard to sort it out. How can you solve these problems? Risk-taking goes up. This is especially ominous for people who are working out in the field in potentially dangerous environments. They're not wearing their body armor. They're not wearing their protective gear. The risk is going up. That can be very, very dangerous. Withdrawal from contact with others. It's another thing that happens in an EOC is that people stop communicating with their colleagues. They pull back. They may have less attention and less concentration on what's going on around them. They become less situationally aware. And if they're less situationally aware, they then become a danger to themselves and others. There's a concept called the general adaptation syndrome, which basically means we are all destined to respond to stress. We do not have an option with that. So if you look at the screen there, it is the baseline, which is the normal everyday stress that people live in. And towards the left of the screen, you see a stimulus entering the picture. There's a red line there that is marked alarm. And alarm is the activation of our psychological and physical defenses against some outside stimulus. It drives us to resist, and resistance is everything we do, and it is not good or bad or right or wrong or smart or dumb. It's just everything we try to do to manage this distress. We then go into exhaustion, because you cannot keep this up for very long. You drop into exhaustion, you go below the baseline, there's a recovery phase, and then back up to the baseline again. And the sequence is normal, and it will repeat itself over and over again. Once you finish one highly stressful thing and you get a little bit of rest, you'll be ready to go on to the next one. We know from the research in this field that the field of stress, that as you increase stress, hey, a good thing happens. Health and performance actually gets better. Um, well, don't depend on that too much because sooner or later you're going to hit maximum adaptive arousal. And when you hit that, all the gains you had with health and performance actually improving will be slipping away with health and performance declining once you pass that maximum adaptive arousal. This is a little diagram that goes along with traumatic stress. You have what's going on in the system before a trauma strikes. And what you'll see there is the thinking is up and the feelings are down and under control. But the dark arrow indicates bad traumatic event entering the picture. What you'll see then is the thinking shrinks and the feelings explode. So the feelings are going to get pretty much out of control. And so you get an exact reversal from the pre-crisis to the crisis stage with the feelings becoming overwhelming and the thinking decreasing in its influence. Now, this slide indicates what happens to performance. So you are going along in the pre-crisis state before anything really bad happens. It's normal as everyday life. You get hit with that point of impact. There's a dotted line in the middle there that indicates that we will always try to keep doing that which we were doing before the traumatic event hit. And then from that, there's going to be an angle of disorganization, which is how fast do you stop functioning at your normal level. And then you'll go into a state of disorganization. There'll be trial and error. And then hopefully we'll get back up to adaptive function, which is listed as number 1 there. Unfortunately, some people get really stuck after a traumatic event. They have a hard time working their way back out of that. A few people, a crisis now can be growth and learning for them later, so they might learn some good things out of it. Most people, though, if we can get back to adaptive function, then we should be pretty pleased with that. This particular diagram indicates performance. Let's take a look at the next one. Okay, what happens in a stress response, especially if it's a traumatic stress, is you're going to have that event occur, and then there's high anxiety, denial, and anger. They tend to come up in the first 3 hours. They sometimes come up together, sometimes they come up in a different order, like you might find people getting angry first and then denying. We find other people deny first and then have anxiety and then get angry. So it doesn't always happen in the exact order shown here. But this slide represents the emotional reaction. Then remorse is a mix of sadness and guilt feelings, and then ultimately grief, which is it's a much more pronounced and prolonged form of mourning, and then reconciliation when we have achieved an acceptance. It's not like happy time, but it's a resignation that what has happened and we can't undo it, and we have to learn to pick up the pieces and move ahead. All right. So this represents the emotional aspects of a crisis reaction, whereas the previous slide represents what's happening in performance. Okay, so how do you manage this stuff? Because it's always nice to talk about it, but we have to give you a way to get out of it. First of all, recognize the signs and symptoms. This is particularly helpful for every individual to do themselves, know when they're getting stressed, but sometimes you have to have recognition by the supervisors. And recognizing is not enough. You have to do something about it. If you don't support your own people, you are going to end up with the loss of unit cohesion and unit performance, and ultimately the capacity to function under duress will dissipate. You need positive leadership, very clear and fair principles of leadership. You also need to have support programs, critical incident stress management teams in place prior to these tragedies occurring. There are 7 principles of crisis intervention. between World War I and World War II, the ones on the left-hand column were developed. The first three came up in World War I. They were proximity, that is, support people close to the operational zone. Immediacy, do it now. Next one is expectancy, set up a positive outcome expectancy. In World War II, brevity and simplicity entered the picture. There were no additions until 1984, and then an author by the name of Slyku introduced innovation and pragmatism. And to this day, those 7 core principles of crisis intervention are still 7. There have been no more added, and I don't expect any more to be added to them. But those are all the principles of crisis intervention we have, those 7: proximity, immediacy, expectancy, brevity, simplicity, innovation, and pragmatism. So you need to have programs in place that are there before, providing education, team training, planning, strategy, those kinds of things. During a mission, immediate support, a lot of that is done one-on-one or individual support. We have a thing called the crisis management briefing, which is an informational program. Supervisors need advice after one-on-one, afterwards one-on-ones, defusings, CISD, critical incident stress debriefing. By the way, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, SAMHSA, has recently added critical incident stress debriefing to the list of interventions that are considered evidence-based. So that's a very big step in this field, that CISD is now seen as an evidence-based intervention for crisis work. Frequent breaks for your personnel. If they're working long days, they need to have breaks after about every 2.5 hours of work. Half a day off every 5 days if it's been continuous work. If you're on a major disaster and you're going for 10 days, people need to get at least 1 day off for every 10 days work. And I know that that seems like an extreme schedule, but some of these disasters will demand a lot of attention for multiple days. Please make sure people get proper food and nourishment. We suggest that you avoid sugar, high fat content foods, processed foods. White bread is a nutrition robber. It does not help. And certainly no alcohol, and limit caffeine. I once had to do therapy with a communications officer who was drinking a gallon of caffeine a day and wondering why he was having trouble sleeping at night. Not very bright, okay? Exercise every day. I worked a disaster one time, gave some advice to the supervisor. The supervisor took it seriously, contacted Sears and Roebuck, the department store, asked if they could loan the exercise equipment they had on display to the EOC during the course of the disaster, set it up in an office. People had a little bit of time each day to get on a treadmill and do a little work on that and kind of get some exercise, and to help keep his staff going a lot better than people who don't do those kinds of things. Go to 8-hour shifts as soon as possible. I know that 12 is where you sometimes start, but you can't keep 12 going indefinitely. And if you do not have 4 hours sleep in 24 hours, you are then going to seriously dysfunction, okay? 17 hours of work will give you symptoms as if you were legally drunk, right? So it's not good to say, oh, I can take it, I'm tough, I can do 24 hours straight. Well, if you do 24 hours straight, you'll be tempted to do more. Guess what? At 72 hours, you will start popping signs of active psychosis, okay? I know some of you sit there and point to others and say, he already has them and it's not from sleep. But no, we're worried about your lack of sleep. Limit exposure, especially under field operations, to gory sights and sounds. they tend to come back and hurt later on. If you have people who are assigned to one duty continuously, that will be a problem. Handling remains is very highly stressful work. There's a number of research projects that have proven that handling remains really leaves people with lasting dents in their psyche. Get a CISM liaison and the EOC, Critical Incident Stress Management liaison. They can be good advisors to you. They can tell you when people need one sort of intervention or another. They can coordinate a lot of the efforts to get outside help in if you need it. Short displays of emotion, that's another thing that people worry about. However, as long as they're doing the job, doesn't matter to me if they got tears rolling down their cheeks. Can they still do the job? It's performance, not emotional display. And an Australian study clearly shows that tears actually causes a reduction in tension and makes people work better and longer if they can get a short burst of tears out of their system. Restore normal routines quickly as possible. Please don't criticize your colleagues in the midst of a crisis. It's really unhelpful, and it does cause a morale bust. So don't do that. Watch your gallows humor. I personally love gallows humor. I use it and have people use it around me all the time. We just have to be very careful to look over your shoulder and make sure you don't have family members of the victims standing nearby and listening to it, because they don't get our humor. Okay, so really be careful with that. That's a sign we're almost done. Expect some anger and frustration. It's a normal response of people who have a lot going on against them. Listen to people who are distressed. If they want to talk about it, let them do it. Please respect each other's viewpoints. The middle of a crisis is not an opportune time to argue somebody else's viewpoint, okay? And keep politics out of the matter, because that'll stir them up more than anything else. Help each other. If they don't look like they're doing well, ask them if they're okay. Ask them how they're doing, and if it looks like they need some help, don't hesitate to at least suggest somebody see them while they're struggling with this. And that's my contact. If anybody wants to take that down in case you need to have a question answer or whatever.